I impaled 20,000 men in a single day and displayed their bodies outside my capital city so that the most powerful army in the world would see them from a distance and turn back. It worked. And the man who ordered that was not a monster. He was a prince who had learned in the hardest possible school that the only language powerful enough to stop an empire is the language of absolute, unforgettable terror. I am Vlad the Third, Prince of Wallachia, son of Vlad the Second of the Order of the Dragon, ruler of a small land caught between powers that wanted to swallow it whole. The world knows me as Vlad the Impaler. Some know me as Dracula, a name that became something far larger and far stranger than I ever was. But before the legends, before the horror stories, before the immortal vampire that a writer invented 4 centuries after my death, there was a real man with a real story that is more extraordinary, more brutal, and more complicated than any fiction ever captured. This is that story. I was born around the year 1431 in Sighișoara, a fortified city in Transylvania, in what is today Romania. My father was Vlad the Second, a military governor and later Prince of Wallachia, who had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman Turks. Because of his membership in that order, my father was known as Vlad Dracul, meaning Vlad of the Dragon. I was his son. In Romanian, the son of Dracul is Dracula. That is the entire origin of the name that has haunted the imagination of the world for 5 centuries. Not a vampire, not a demon, the son of a man who belonged to a Christian military order dedicated to fighting the Turks. My childhood was shaped by a world in permanent crisis. Wallachia, the small principality my father ruled, sat directly in the path of the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe. To the north was Hungary, a Christian kingdom that expected Wallachia's loyalty and military cooperation. To the south was the Ottoman Sultan, the most powerful ruler in the world at that time, who expected tribute, obedience, and soldiers. My father spent his entire reign navigating between these 2 giants, trying to keep Wallachia alive by never fully committing to either side. It was a strategy that required constant compromise, constant betrayal of one power to satisfy the other, and it taught me from my earliest years that in a world of empires, small nations survive only through cunning or through terror. There is no third option. When I was around 11 or 12 years old, my father made a decision that I never fully forgave him for, even though I came to understand its political logic. He traveled to meet Sultan Murad II to negotiate terms and renew his loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan demanded proof of that loyalty in the most personal way possible. He wanted hostages. My father handed over my younger brother Radu and me to the Ottomans. We were to live at the Ottoman court as guarantees of my father's good behavior. If my father rebelled, we would pay the price. I want you to think about what that means for a moment. Imagine being a child, handed by your own father to the most powerful empire in the world, taken to a foreign court where you are simultaneously a guest and a prisoner, treated with formal courtesy and constant implicit threat. Everything I became, every decision I made as a ruler, every method I chose to govern and to fight, was shaped by those years in Ottoman captivity. I learned Turkish. I learned Ottoman military tactics and strategy in extraordinary detail. I observed how the empire administered its vast territories, how it maintained loyalty through a combination of reward and punishment so calculated it was almost a science. And I learned something else, something that would define my entire reign. I learned exactly how effective terror is as a tool of power, because I lived under its shadow every single day. My brother Radu adapted to Ottoman life in a very different way than I did. He became genuinely assimilated, learned to love Ottoman culture, converted eventually to Islam, and became a favorite of the Sultan's court. He and I grew in opposite directions during those years, two brothers shaped by the same captivity into completely different men. Radu chose to become part of the empire that held him. I chose to study it like an enemy I intended to defeat. That difference between us would eventually put us on opposite sides of a war for the throne of our own homeland. While Radu and I were held by the Ottomans, the world back home was collapsing. In 1447, my father was overthrown and killed by the Hungarian governor John Hunyadi and Wallachian boyars who had turned against him. My older brother Mircea, the heir to the throne, was captured, blinded with hot iron rods, and buried alive. My family, the people who were supposed to be protected by the arrangement that had placed me in Ottoman hands, were destroyed, while I sat in a foreign court, unable to do anything about it. I was released by the Ottomans the following year, and what followed was a decade of political struggle that would have broken most men permanently. I ruled Wallachia for the first time in 1448, placed on the throne by Ottoman support, but I lasted barely 2 months before being driven out by Hungarian-backed forces. I spent years in exile, first under Ottoman protection, then, remarkably, under the protection of John Hunyadi himself, the man who had been responsible for my father's death. Politics in that part of the world at that time had no room for personal grievance. Survival required alliances with whoever was most useful, regardless of history. I swallowed what I felt and made myself useful to Hunyadi. I learned from him, and I waited. What would you have done in my place? Your father handed you to his enemies as a child. Those same enemies killed your father and your brother while you were their prisoner. You spent years in exile, dependent on the charity of men connected to your family's destruction. Would you have given up? Would you have accepted that fate and disappeared quietly into history? Or would you have done what I did, which was to remember everything, learn everything, and prepare for the moment when the world would give you one more chance? That chance came in 1456. With Hungarian support, I reclaimed the throne of Wallachia for the second time, and this time I intended to hold it. What followed was a reign of 6 years that left marks on the history of Eastern Europe that have never fully faded, and that gave me the name by which the entire world has known me ever since. I want to be precise about what I did and why I did it, because the legend has buried the reality under layers of horror that miss the essential point. Wallachia, when I took the throne, was a land in a state of profound disorder. The noble class, the boyars, had spent generations switching allegiances, overthrowing princes whenever it suited their interests, and accumulating power at the expense of every institution that might have given the country stability. Corruption was not occasional, it was systematic. The roads were unsafe, trade had collapsed, the peasant population lived in a state of chronic insecurity with no reliable protection from anyone. I decided that the first task of my reign was to establish order so complete and so unambiguous that no one in Wallachia would ever again be uncertain about what the consequences of breaking it would be. The method I chose was impalement. I did not invent it. I had seen it used during my years with the Ottomans, and I understood its psychological power with a clarity that came from having observed it from the receiving end. A man who has been executed by sword or hanging is simply dead. A man displayed on a stake is a message. It is a statement addressed not to the dead man, but to every living person who sees him. The message is simple and requires no translation. This is what happens here. This is what this ruler is willing to do. Decide accordingly. The stories that spread across Europe about my methods were not entirely fabrications, but they were written by my enemies and shaped by the political interests of those who wanted me removed. German merchants, whose trade privileges I had stripped, wrote pamphlets describing my cruelties in terms designed to horrify readers as far away as the printing presses of Western Germany. Those pamphlets were among the first mass-produced propaganda documents in European history, printed on the newly invented printing press and distributed specifically to destroy my reputation. I was the first European ruler to be the target of a systematic printing press propaganda campaign. That fact alone should tell you something about how seriously the powers around me took the threat I represented. Because the real threat I represented was not cruelty for its own sake. It was independence. I was a small prince of a small land who had decided that Wallachia was going to stop being a tributary of the Ottoman Empire. In 1459, I stopped paying the annual tribute the Ottomans demanded. I expelled Ottoman merchants and tax collectors from my territory. I sent a message to Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had just conquered Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire, that Wallachia was no longer available for the taking. Mehmed II, the most powerful ruler in the world, sent envoys to bring me back into compliance. I had them impaled. Their turbans were nailed to their heads first, since they had refused to remove them in my presence as protocol required. The Sultan received what was left of his ambassadors as my response to his demands. What followed was inevitable. In 1462, Mehmed II led a massive Ottoman army personally into Wallachia. Contemporary estimates of the Ottoman force range from 60,000 to over 100,000 men. I had perhaps 20 or 30,000. By any conventional military calculation, there was no contest. But I had no intention of fighting a conventional war. I burned everything in the Ottoman path. Crops, villages, wells, anything that could sustain an advancing army was destroyed before they could reach it. I sent teams to poison water sources. I directed raiding parties to strike the Ottoman camp at night, creating confusion and casualties without ever engaging in the open battle, where their numbers would overwhelm mine. And then came the night of the 7th of June in 1462, an event that Ottoman chroniclers recorded with unconcealed shock. I led a night raid directly into the Ottoman camp with the specific objective of reaching Mehmed's tent and ending the war in a single stroke. We came close, closer than any enemy had come to the Sultan in living memory. We did not reach him, but the chaos we created that night shook the confidence of an army that had never experienced anything like it. And then came Targovishta. As the Ottoman army advanced toward my capital, they found the city abandoned, and surrounding it, stretching across the plain for miles in every direction, they found what history has called the Forest of the Impaled. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners and collaborators, displayed on stakes of varying heights, arranged in a pattern that covered an area larger than most cities. The Sultan, by every account that survives, looked at what I had created and ordered his army to stop. His own chroniclers recorded that he said a man capable of such things deserved to rule a greater empire. The Ottoman army, the force that had taken Constantinople, that had ended the Byzantine Empire, that had never been stopped by any Christian power in a generation, turned around and went home. My Forest of the Impaled had done what no army in Europe had managed to do. I wonder what you are thinking right now. Because I know that what I did at Targovishta is the moment that defines me for most people, the moment that makes them decide what I was. And I ask only this: 20,000 lives to turn back an army that would have enslaved or destroyed an entire nation. Is there a number that makes that calculation acceptable? Is there a scale at which the mathematics of survival becomes something other than horror? I am not asking you to agree with what I did. I am asking you to sit with the question honestly, the way I sat with it then, in a small principality surrounded by empires, with no allies I could fully trust, and no options that did not involve catastrophic cost. The Ottomans withdrew, but my position was not secure. My brother, Radu, the brother who had remained in Ottoman favor, was sent back into Wallachia at the head of an Ottoman-supported force to take my throne. And here is the part of my story that is most painful to tell. He succeeded. Not through military superiority, but because the Wallachian boyars, the noble class I had spent 6 years disciplining and controlling with an iron hand, chose to support my brother over me. They had never forgiven me for removing their privileges and their immunity from the law. When Radu arrived with Ottoman backing, enough of them switched sides to make my position untenable. I was forced to flee north, into Transylvania, into Hungary, looking for the support that would allow me to reclaim my throne one more time. What I found instead was imprisonment. The Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, who had promised support against the Ottomans, had me arrested and held in captivity for approximately 12 years. The exact reasons have been debated by historians ever since. Some believe Matthias received forged letters, supposedly from me, offering allegiance to the Ottomans, documents almost certainly fabricated by his own advisors, who had no interest in a strong, independent Wallachia on Hungary's southern border. Others believe it was pure political calculation. Whatever the reason, I spent over a decade as a prisoner in Hungary, this time in relatively comfortable captivity, allowed to hunt and to receive visitors, but a prisoner nonetheless. During those years in Hungarian captivity, something remarkable happened. I converted from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism, which was the price of Hungarian support for any future attempt to reclaim my throne. I also married a relative of the Hungarian royal family, a woman whose name history has not fully preserved. I had children. I rebuilt, patiently and methodically, the political relationships that would eventually give me one more chance at the throne that had defined my entire life. That chance came in 1476. With Hungarian military support, I reclaimed the throne of Wallachia for the 3rd time. My 3rd reign lasted only 2 months. In late 1476, or very early 1477, I was killed. The circumstances of my death are one of the genuine mysteries of medieval history. I was killed in battle near Bucharest, but beyond that basic fact, almost nothing is certain. Some accounts say I was cut down fighting. Others suggest treachery by my own men. One account claims I was mistaken for an Ottoman soldier and killed by my own forces in the confusion of battle. My head was sent to Constantinople, where Mehmed II had it displayed to prove to his empire that the prince who had dared to defy him was finally gone. My body was buried at the monastery of Snagov, on an island in a lake near Bucharest, according to the tradition that has been accepted for centuries. But when archaeologists excavated the supposed burial site in 1931, they found the tomb empty. A headless body was found in another location within the monastery, but its identification has never been fully confirmed. I came into the world in mystery, and I left it the same way, giving nothing away, leaving no final certainty for the ages to hold on to. 4 centuries after my death, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker combined fragments of my story with Eastern European folklore about the undead and created a fictional character called Count Dracula. He borrowed my name, my homeland of Transylvania, a few details of my history, and built around them one of the most enduring fictional characters in the history of literature. The vampire that bears my name has appeared in hundreds of films, thousands of books, and has been seen by more people than any other villain in the history of storytelling. I find a dark irony in this that I think I would have appreciated even in life. I spent my entire existence fighting to be taken seriously, fighting to be seen as a ruler of substance and intelligence rather than simply a cruel man. And what the world remembered of me was a fictional creature of the night that drinks blood and sleeps in a coffin. But here is what I want you to take away from my story, now that you have heard it fully. In Romania, I am not remembered as a monster. I am remembered as a national hero, a man who stood alone against the most powerful empire in the world and made it back down. A man who imposed order on a chaotic land through methods that history judges harshly, but that his own people, living in the reality of that time and that place, understood as necessary. The question of whether I was a monster or a defender depends entirely on which side of the border you were standing on, and which empire you feared more. I am Vlad the Third, Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, and although a fictional vampire stole my name and wore it for 5 centuries, here I remain, beneath the legend, more real and more complicated than any story anyone invented about me. In every person who looks past the myth and asks who I actually was, in every small nation that has ever stood in the path of an empire and refused to simply disappear, in the truth that the most terrifying thing in the world is not a monster in the dark. It is a man who has decided, with complete clarity, exactly how far he is willing to go.